under that kind of pressure, I think it's very easy to imagine an old man who had never really had that kind of experience before. King Leonidas' wife was his niece, Gorgo. Tell us what to do. Now you have to decide. You have to decide now because the Persians are coming. Okay, they're coming. They're going to kill us all. What do you do? What do you do? What do you do? So my name is Roel. I'm a historian of ancient Greece. I work at Lincoln College, University of Oxford. I'm here to answer some questions about Leonidas. Was King Leonidas real? Yes, he was real. He was a real king of Sparta. He was one of the members of the Agiat house, one of the two houses, royal houses of Sparta. He ruled from about 490 or shortly thereafter BC to his death in 480. Was King Leonidas a good king? I think this is not something that historians really judge in that sense. I mean, what does it mean to be a good king? What does it mean to be a bad king? The interesting thing about Leonidas is we know practically nothing about him as king. We know that he was quite old when he came to power. He was about probably 50 or so. And he only came to power because his older brother had died. I mean, he'd ruled for a long time, had essentially ended up taking his own life, at which point Leonidas came to the throne quite late in his life. And so for most of his life, he was actually not a king. He was just a subject of his brother. And so he was only king for a short period of time, which also happens to be a period where we don't know very much about what Sparta was up to. So we don't really hear anything about the rule of Leonidas that lasted about a decade until finally Xerxes invaded Greece, and Leonidas was the one who was selected to lead the Spartan army to Thermopylae. And so essentially the only thing we know about him and his policy and his rule is that he eventually led this army. So it's hard to know. You judge him essentially by his actions in that campaign. Was King Leonidas Greek? Yes. This is one of those things. Yes, he was Greek. I don't know who questions this. I don't think there's any doubts about this. The Spartans themselves were Greeks. The Spartans were one of the peoples of the southern Peloponnese. They were Dorian Greeks, so they were one of the ethnic subgroups of the Greek population of mainland Greece. There is an older, much older 19th century theory that the Spartans had, or the Dorians rather in general, had migrated from the Balkans or from Northern Europe even into the southern Balkan Peninsula, into mainland Greece. But this is something that's based on sort of these offhand references to the fact that people like Helen of Sparta were famously sort of light-haired, fair in terms of their complexion. There's just a lot of variety within the population of mainland Greece, so we're not really bothered by the fact that some Spartans are sometimes described as being quite light in terms of their complexion. That doesn't concern us. The story that the Dorians, which the Greeks themselves told, that the Dorians themselves came from the north and invaded the Peloponnese, is something that still gets repeated sometimes, but there's just no archaeological evidence that this actually happened. So this seems to be just a founding myth that we shouldn't take too seriously. And so the Spartans, even though they ruled over a population and they told the story that they had invaded and subjected this population, what actually seems to have happened is that just like everywhere else in the Greek world, they represent an elite that rose to the top and essentially accrued political power to itself, but there's nothing to distinguish them from the population that they subjected, and they were just a local population essentially. So they may have migrated in at some point in prehistory, but they were in all senses just as Greek as the Athenians or the other peoples of that peninsula. And so Leonidas, being one of the members of this people, was himself also Greek. Who were King Leonidas's parents? So Leonidas was the son of King Anaxagoras of Sparta. So he is one of the first kings that we really know much about, although the lineage is quite well known because later authors would sort of try to compile the ancestry of the kings of Sparta, and this is one of the ways in which they dated the Archaic period. We know practically nothing about the earlier kings. So Anaxandridas is one of the first ones that is actually known, like when he ruled and what he may have done. So this is the period when Sparta rises to rule over the rest of the Peloponnese. Leonidas was the third son. He was himself not the eldest. He was the third son and one of a set of twins. He was the elder of a set of twins, Leonidas and Cleombrotus. So Leonidas is himself sort of one of the younger children of this particular generation of the Agiad royal house. We know very little about his mother. That is usually the case. We know actually very little about his father either. And that generally tends to happen. And the further you go back in Greek history, that we just simply don't have the detail to say very much about what these people were like or what they did. We just know that this particular generation, which really emerges from history in the works of Herodotus and really sort of starts to take on a more tangible form, was incredibly influential in Spartan history. I think it's in Plutarch's Life of Agesilaus, which is another Spartan king from a later period, that Plutarch actually says, "Oh, Xenophon didn't bother to record his mother's name or his sister's name or something like that, but I went to check. I went to look it up," which other authors would consider to be sort of not important enough to bother with, which unfortunately happens a lot. You'll get sort of figures who even sometimes are prominent in the anecdotes and stories that historians will tell, but that just never receive a name. So, who were King Leonidas' siblings? This is a really interesting one. So, Leonidas was the third of four brothers that we know about. He may have had more siblings. We don't know about them. But the interesting thing is that he was third eldest, which means his eldest brother Cleomenes became king, obviously because he was first in line to the throne. And in the Spartan system, the kingdom devolved onto the eldest male in the line. His second oldest brother, Dorieus, was unable to accept this. He felt that he should become king. So he felt that a wrong had been done to him when Cleomenes became king. And so he actually abandoned Sparta. Like he requested to be sent out to found a colony, which eventually ended up first in Africa on the coast of what is now Libya, where he was driven out by the Carthaginians. So he took his colonizing efforts to Sicily, where he was destroyed by the local population. So essentially the colony failed. But this is something that happened in the archaic period sometimes, that dissenting minorities, dissenting factions within a population, such as disgruntled heirs who wanted to become king but couldn't, ended up leaving and trying to form their own community, essentially, with blackjack and hookers. So the idea is that you take that part of the population, whoever else might be disaffected, you take them somewhere else. And in Doria's case, this didn't work, and so he actually met a premature end in Sicily. So Dorea is out of the picture. And Leonidas ends up being sort of second in line, even though he's the third brother. He also has a younger twin, Cleombrotus. After Leonidas dies in battle at Thermopylae, Cleombrotus becomes king. Cleombrotus almost immediately dies. He's only king for about 8 months or so only for the period 480 to 479. And before the Persians are even fully defeated in the Persian Wars, Cleombrotus also dies. And that sort of means the end of this particular generation of the Agiad house. We don't know why. So Herodotus just says that he led the army to the isthmus in 480, but didn't advance beyond it. And then the next campaign season, Cleombrotus is sort of retroactively mentioned like he's dead now. And in fact, this is a theme because later on we'll get to Pleistarchus, the son of Leonidas, who apparently died in his early 30s for reasons unknown. So that's, it just happened. Who was King Leonidas's wife? King Leonidas's wife was his niece, Gorgo. So Gorgon was the daughter of King Cleomenes, so his elder half-brother. Actually, we should have said that at some point. So his dad remarried, right? So he was the son of his second wife. In order to solidify the legitimacy of that succession, he marries the daughter of the last king, which is a fairly common thing to happen in ancient history more generally, not just in the Greek, not just in the Spartan tradition, but also in other places that have kings. We know that Gorgo was about 8 years old at the time of the Ionian Revolt in 499, when Aristagoras, the tyrant of Miletus, goes to Sparta to ask for help against the Persians. So at the time that Cleomenes dies, he takes his own life around 490. Leonidas then takes the throne, marries her, at which point she would have been about 17 years old. So we can see that he would be at the time about 15, marrying his niece about 17. Shortly thereafter, she gives birth to a son, who is Pleistarchus. And after that, we don't hear anything else about Gorgo until she plays a part in the proceedings of the Persian invasion. Gorgo is a really interesting figure, actually, and Herodotus is really keen to preserve many anecdotes about her. She ends up being, in later tradition, both in Herodotus and in later authors, something of the kind of template of the ideal Persian or ideal Spartan wife, the ideal Spartan queen. So she comes up in a lot of anecdotes about how the women of Sparta represent the ideals and propagate the ideals of Spartan values. So she is the one who is associated with that famous quotes about Sparta, that are attributed to Spartan women. So, for instance, the quote that Spartan women are the only ones who give birth to men, which is actually repeated in the movie 300. And there are a couple of other quotes like that which are attached to Gorgo. And in this story about the Ionian revolt that I just mentioned, where Aristagoras comes from Asia Minor to ask King Cleomenes for help, it's basically considered a bad idea to go and help them. And Herodotus makes that clear in the story. But Cleomenes was being tempted by Aristagoras, being tempted by the promise of riches, promise of plunder, until Gorgo, who's in the room with him as a little girl, basically tells him like, this man is going to bribe you, this man is going to corrupt you. And at that point, Cleomenes comes to his senses and sends Aristagoras away. So she is the one who perceives the moral corruptness that comes out of Aristagoras the tyrant and comes out of the Ionians. Queen Gorgo is there represented already as this kind of ideal paragon of Spartan values. And later on, she's also represented in some anecdotes as very smart. So she is the one who deciphers a hidden message that comes from Leonidas at Thermopylae, for instance. So there's a couple of occasions where Gorgo comes into the story, always in a positive light. So she's a really, really interesting figure, but obviously heavily idealized. And that may be partly because she ended up being wife to essentially the perfect Spartan king, the Spartan king who embodied in a lot of ways these Spartan values. Did King Leonidas expect to become king? No. So as I've said, King Leonidas was third eldest brother and half brother to the King Cleomenes, who first rose to the throne. And he had expected, presumably, Cleomenes to remain king until his old age and then to be succeeded by his son. And Cleomenes did indeed rule for a good long while. I mean, possibly about 30 years. But first, he ended up taking his own life, so he died prematurely. And secondly, he died without male issue, so he had no heir. Which is why, with Dorias out of the picture, as I said, Dorias has gone up to Sicily and died. Leonidas unexpectedly ended up being first in line to the throne. So that was quite unexpected. And in fact, that meant that Leonidas, unlike normal Spartan kings, had actually supposedly gone through the Spartan upbringing. So this whole, this harsh picture we have of Spartan boys being taken from their parents and sent through this education program. We don't know to what extent that was already in place at the time that Leonidas was a boy, but at the same time, we are explicitly told that he did go through this education system, unlike the ones who were known to be heirs to the throne. So normally Spartan sort of crown princes were exempt from this, but Leonidas, expecting never to become king, was treated like any other Spartiate and therefore had to go through the system. The obviously more salacious story to be added to that is that not only did he not expect to become king, he essentially engineered his way into it by effectively murdering Cleomenes by proxy. But this is an unconfirmed story that some historians have hypothesized and speculated on. We obviously don't know anything about this. But the thing is, Cleomenes, in the later years of his reign, was supposed to have gone mad. So he was, behaving erratically. He was punching random people in the street. He was not behaving like a proper Spartan king should. And so, for his own safety or the safety of other Spartiates, he was thrown in prison. And then at some point, he managed to acquire a knife with which he first mutilated himself and then took his own life. And the question is, where did he get the knife from? Herodotus says that he got the knife from a random helot. He persuaded him to give him the weapon, who was sort of guarding the cell. But the speculation there is that it's kind of suspicious that Leonidas became king very late in life and at the same time married Cleomenes' daughter Gorgo. Now, Gorgo, of course, more than anyone else in Sparta, would have had access to her father. Even in his cell, she would have had the easiest time getting to him. And so if she plotted with Leonidas to marry him and for him to become king so that she could become queen, then that might be a convenient way for her to do that, essentially to go to his cell to visit him, slip him a knife knowing he was not in his good senses, and essentially leave things to take their course. And so there is a theory that Leonidas engineered with Gorgo to essentially get rid of Cleomenes and then take the throne. So it was not only unexpected, but it wasn't going to happen until Leonidas essentially engineered his own succession. That is entirely speculative. That is based on these sort of fragments from bits from Herodotus that we can piece together in different ways, that we can piece together in a way that is friendly to Leonidas or hostile to him as we see fit. But that is one of the ways in which we can accredit both Leonidas and Gorgo with a more proactive role in securing the kingship for him. So that may be how it happened, but we will never know. Did King Leonidas rule alone? No. So Sparta, very unusually in history, and for reasons that we don't quite understand, had two kings. So there are two royal families, both of which always had a king on the throne. So there's always going to be one of each family that would have been ruling together. And it's always going to be one from each family until the very end of those dynasties, when briefly only one family survives and then that one gets offed as well. So there's the Agiad house, of which Leonidas was a representative, and there's the Eurypontid house, which is the other one, essentially. In this period, the Eurypontid house is very much the junior one, the one that has less influence. The ones we hear about, mostly like Cleomenes, are the dominant ones. They come from the Agiad house. But after that, for a long period in the classical age, in the fifth century BC and into the fourth, it's actually the Eurypontid house that ends up being dominant. So they are the ones who provide the kings that are the most powerful in setting Spartan policy and in leading Spartan armies abroad. So at this point, the turning point there is kind of Leonidas himself, who does this incredibly heroic thing that everybody looks up to, that everybody thinks is admirable, but in so doing, kind of delegates his house to the junior position because succession after him is really messy. And several of the figures that do succeed end up being just not able to put much of a stamp on Spartan policy. So those are the two houses that continue to exist essentially since mythical times. From time immemorial, you have these two royal houses, and they persist until basically the end of the third century BC. Did King Leonidas live like royalty? Spartan kings did not live as we imagine kings to live. They didn't have palaces, they didn't have courts or entourages, they didn't have courtiers hanging about them. We really need to see their kingship as something that is called kingship, but actually is, in practice, something a little bit different. Aristotle referred to Spartan kings as essentially hereditary generals for life. So they're not quite kings in the way that the Persian kings were kings. They're more like kings in the sense of a permanent magistracy within the Spartan constitution. They have certain responsibilities. They're priests of Zeus. They lead armies abroad. They can form foreign policy when they're leading an army. But when they're at home, they're under the immediate scrutiny of the ephors. So the ephors essentially decide what they do. They can also hold them accountable. And they are members of the Gerousia, members of the Council of Elders, without being able to determine its policy or its decisions. So their rule is actually a little bit circumscribed, and they don't have the same royal authority that we imagine sort of a medieval king or an early modern king to have in the European tradition. So in that sense, they don't live like kings. They don't have much wealth. They don't really stand out as being, opulent landowners, for instance. They might have had a little bit more in terms of both wealth and honor and possessions and allocations of wealth as well within the Spartan system than ordinary Spartiates. But to a large extent, actually, their position was guaranteed purely by this inheritance. And they had to work quite a lot to secure their position. They had to play the same game as other Spartans to keep themselves socioeconomically situated. So they had to worry quite a lot about maintaining their estates, about marriage, making the right marriage links, about maintaining their wealth level, because all of their status and all status in Spartan society was based on wealth. So you really had to worry about making sure that you stayed rich, essentially, and the Spartan kings were no exception. But notoriously, their houses were not really very distinguishable from the houses of other Spartiates, and they were subject to the ephors' authority to such an extent. I mean, one of them at some point had their house destroyed. I mean, they were just like leveled by the ephors as punishment for becoming corrupt, for selling out Spartan interests, essentially. So we have to picture them really as one of the most prominent, but otherwise just one among many Spartiate families. And that is also how their power was expressed. But they didn't have the same kind of, throne room, courtier system, ritualized sort of approaches and things like that you might associate much more with the Persian kings. And of course, especially by the fourth century, especially King Agesilaus quite famously adopted a lot of the Spartan means of austerity, a lot of the Spartan sort of ostentatiously plain living that was meant to express their values and meant to sort of show their ideals and practice, which meant that as a Spartan king, he actually lived sort of in a very austere and plain fashion. He was trying to not appear like the kings of the East, essentially trying to explicitly disavow this kind of luxurious living, even though he was obviously very wealthy and at the top of Spartan society. He was trying to pretend much in the way that other Spartans would, that he was actually just one of the guys and was living like everybody else and was not in any sense attached to luxury. What was King Leonidas' early life like? We know pretty much nothing about it. So Leonidas pops up in the sources very much because of the Battle of Thermopylae. About his earlier life, we know practically nothing, except that he went through the Spartan upbringing, which is exceptional, which is because he was one of the younger brothers of his family. And so unlike his older brother Cleomenes, he had to go through this upbringing. Now, at that time, we don't really know what that entailed. We know only from later sources, especially from the 4th century BC and onwards, what the Spartan upbringing actually entailed. But most of what it seems to be is that during the daytime, they were grouped together with other boys the same age and essentially indoctrinated in Spartan values. So they were playing together, they were being taught together, they were from a certain age onward, probably from about their teenage years, trained together in various sports. So they're made to exercise together. And they were held under constant supervision. And that is the main thing about this upbringing, is that even though they weren't necessarily always in class, essentially, they weren't always either training or learning something, they were constantly being supervised by their elder peers in order to make sure that they were being instilled in the correct values and they were behaving in the way that befitted a Spartan. So they were all living essentially in the same way. They were all being denied a lot of creature comforts. They were all being made to go barefoot, for instance, wear simple clothes. They weren't allotted sufficient food, so that they had to try and find ways to secure additional food in order to eat well. And they were made to live outside together, and under this constant supervision, made to compete with each other constantly for the honor of being seen as the most Spartan among this generation of young Spartans. Essentially, what that means in practice, what that means on a day-to-day level, we really don't know very well. But it does seem to mean that he would have been very thoroughly indoctrinated in the kind of values that were meant to be exemplary in Sparta. So obedience, deference to elders, obedience to the laws, obedience to the commands of the king and the elders, and this ostentatious self-denial, this kind of subsuming of the self to the interests of the wider community, this austerity, this lack of ostentatious sort of pride in yourself, this lack of luxury, this lack of ambition to outdo others, except in values that were meant to be of interest to the wider community. The upbringing has traditionally been characterized as a way to create good warriors, but more recent scholarship has really put a lot of that into question, has noted that all of our accounts that we have of it focus much more on things like, learning how to recite poetry and speak like a Spartan, learning how to dance, learning how to behave like a Spartan, rather than on martial skills or values. But it was absolutely meant to turn these young Spartan boys into good citizens. And that is really the focus of that upbringing, is how to slot into a society that holds certain values in high esteem, how to behave accordingly. And that is what Leonidas would have learned when he was a boy. What age was King Leonidas when he died? So that is the one thing that we do know, like, that he came to power when he was about 50, and that he ruled for about a decade, essentially, and led the army to Thermopylae when he was about 60, where obviously he was killed in battle. So he would have been about 60 years old. Was Leonidas involved in other campaigns or wars before the Persian Wars? This is a really interesting one. We don't know, right? We never hear anything about what Leonidas did, either as a Spartan citizen or as a king, before Thermopylae. But we do know something about Spartan history, because there's quite a detailed narrative in Herodotus of the rule of his elder brother Cleomenes. And so there's quite a few campaigns that we hear about that Leonidas would have been old enough to participate in. I mean, if he was about 50 in 490, then he might have been serving in those armies as a private citizen, essentially, as somebody who was drafted, essentially, to participate in these militia armies that would have been sent out for about 30 years. He would have been liable to serve from age 18, likely to have been liable to serve in the field army, so, to be actually sent out on expedition from age 20. The boys aged 18 or 19 were very rarely sent out in the Greek world in general. And so for possibly about 30 years, he would have been serving on campaigns under his brother, or possibly under one of the other kings, so King Demaratus, until near the very end of his reign. So we hear of a Spartan army randomly in Boeotia, in central Greece in 519 BC. We have no idea what it was doing there, but that might have been the first campaign in which King Leonidas himself took part. With his brother Cleomenes, so in that army with his brother. Later, there were several campaigns that the Spartans fought against the tyrants at Athens, so against the Pisistratids. They invaded Attica several times. In several of those campaigns, Leonidas may have participated. At the end of the 490s, they also invaded Aegina. They meddled in the affairs of that city. Again, Leonidas may have participated. None of this is confirmed, but Sparta was obviously quite active in that period. And so, as a citizen, as somebody who would have been liable to military service, somebody who went through the upbringing, was ready to be a full citizen and take part and take on all the obligations that entailed, he may well have served in those armies. What did other Greek cities think of him? Was he regarded as particularly brave even for a Spartan or average? How was he thought of by the people of Sparta? The thing is, no one obviously says anything about Leonidas before Thermopylae. He is considered a complete unknown, and as a king seems to have done essentially nothing of note. I mean, he's not noted to have taken any initiative in the 10 years before Thermopylae. So as far as kings go, he seems to have been one of the sort of more passive ones in the sense that we don't have the ability to connect any particular act of Spartan policy to Leonidas. He only served in the Battle of Thermopylae, but that battle came to be seen as such a paragon, such an expression of Spartan values, that after his death, he ended up being essentially seen as the ultimate Spartan. And so, even though we as moderns can question the validity of this kind of idolization, I mean, we can question whether it made sense for him to do this, to throw away his life at Thermopylae. Strategically, this was obviously a mistake, and Herodotus makes clear that this affected the alliance quite severely, and people lost a lot of faith in Spartan leadership at that point. But after the Persian Wars had been won, there was clearly this massive rehabilitation of Leonidas as the great hero who had shown the Greeks how to behave in the face of this overwhelming external threat. And so Leonidas became, in Sparta, the great hero. And a lot of other Greeks essentially seem to have accepted this. I mean, they seem to have agreed that Leonidas did something that was truly heroic. And so Athenians never really questioned this. I mean, several later Athenian authors are always saying that, Leonidas is obviously a great hero who did something that the other Spartans look up to as being the great example for them. Fighting to the death in the face of insurmountable odds is absolutely something that the Spartans lionized, and that other Greeks could agree is like, okay, well, that is truly valorous. That is a true sign of courage. And in fact, later authors, not necessarily Athenian, also describe it that way. So Pausanias, actually, the travel author from the Roman period, describes him in unbelievably lauding terms. So he's writing in the 2nd century AD, almost more than 600 years after Leonidas' self-sacrifice. And he says, although the Greeks have waged many wars, and so have foreigners amongst themselves, yet there are but few that have been made more illustrious by the exceptional valor of one man, in the way that Achilles shed luster on the Trojan War and Miltiades on the engagement of Marathon. So there is a comparison there between other heroes, even within the Persian Wars. But he says, in truth, the success of Leonidas surpassed, in my opinion, all later as well as all previous achievements. So there's this understanding that Leonidas is not just a great Spartan, but literally just the greatest person to ever live, according to this particular tradition. Again, we can question that, but for the Spartans, it clearly became a huge symbol shortly after the Persian Wars of what it was to be a Spartan and what it meant to behave like a Spartan. So sometime a few decades after the Persian Wars, they go out of their way to bring Leonidas' body back, or so they say. I mean, they went to the battlefield where he had previously been thrown into a mass grave, presumably by the Persians. They put his head on a stake at the battlefield and dumped his body in a pit. The Spartans supposedly recovered that body in the 450s or 440s, brought it back to Sparta, built a tomb in the middle of the city, a great sort of tomb of a hero. They worshipped him and gave him a heroic cult, which meant that annually they organized the games in honor of Leonidas. They celebrated him with contests and games at his tomb, and they continued doing that for centuries afterwards. So they essentially gave him heroic cult, heroic status, which is to say that he became something in between mortal and god, somebody who was turned into more than mortal after his death by the cult that was awarded to him. We know that Pausanias became regent after Leonidas died at Thermopylae because Leonidas' son was too young to become king. Whatever happened to Leonidas' son? So Leonidas obviously marries Queen Gorgo at the beginning of his reign. And sometime after that, we don't know exactly when, she bears him a son whose name is Pleistarchus. That son obviously becomes king when Leonidas dies because, again, primogeniture, I mean, this is just the eldest son of the current king should become king. But given that Leonidas has only ruled for about 10 years, this king must have been 10 years old or less, right? I mean, possibly only 9 or less. And so he was a minor, and Pausanias, who is the son of Cleombrotus, Leonidas' twin brother, becomes the regent on his behalf. Pleistarchus eventually does become king. Obviously, he grows to maturity and then becomes king. But unfortunately, he doesn't seem to live for very long. So he's king until his death in about 458. If he was born around 490 or shortly thereafter, that means that at his death, he was only about 31, 32. We don't know why he dies. We're not told. He quite possibly simply became ill and died for one reason or another, which again is quite common in the ancient world. We have absolutely no record of the reasons why, the story behind his death. We are just told by a very late source, in fact, because contemporary sources completely gloss over this, that he died and that he had no sons himself, which means that that branch of the Agiat house essentially died out with him. Leonidas had no further children who might pick this up. And so he was succeeded by Pleistoanax, who was the son of that same Pausanias, who was regent on his behalf before. So we skip over to another branch of that family of Anaxandridas, the younger twin brother of Leonidas. That is the house that takes over and then creates the new branch of the Agiat house. Again, nothing really is known of Pleistarchus. We don't know any achievement that can really be credited to him. He is, as I've said, that branch of the family ends up being the less prominent one. So it ends up being the one that doesn't shape Spartan policy, doesn't manage to become very influential in Spartan politics, except in certain specific occasions. And so Pleistarchus, much like his father Leonidas, is not really known for anything. And like Leonidas might have faded into obscurity, if not for the fact that Leonidas did this one thing that made him into the paragon of Spartan values. Did Spartan royalty go through the education system? What did they do if not? I mean, this is something I've covered already, but essentially Spartan kings, if they were known to be heirs to the throne, they would not go through the system. If they were not in line, not first in line, they would go through it and they were treated as ordinary citizens. We know, for instance, in the 4th century, King Agesilaus was also not in line to the throne when he was born. He was one of the younger sons of the family, and so he also went through the upbringing and later then became king unexpectedly because of shenanigans. The thing is that Spartan royal succession is extremely fraught. Essentially, none of these successions are very clean father to son until sort of the middle of the 5th century, and then only briefly. So in the period, especially surrounding Cleomenes and Leonidas, a lot of these successions don't go in this straight line. Leonidas is succeeded by a son, but it has to be a regent, and then afterwards his son quickly dies and has to be succeeded by essentially his cousin. So there's a lot of that kind of stuff going on. Kings are sent into exile. Kings are, in one case, executed. Kings are deposed, removed from power. Kings die without heirs. This sort of thing happens all the time within both Spartan royal houses, which means that the succession is very rarely regular, very rarely predictable. And so quite a few Spartan kings may have actually gone through the Spartan upbringing, but it wasn't supposed to happen. There's supposed to be a father-to-son line in which the first son, who is meant to be the heir, does not go through the upbringing like other Spartans. Most likely because the upbringing, as I've said, teaches you to be a good Spartan citizen, teaches you to be deferent, teaches you to subsume yourself to be part of a society of supposed outward equals, one among many, whereas the kings were simply not. I mean, they were something else. They didn't need to think of themselves quite so much as the so-called homoioi, the similars, the ones who were full Spartan citizens. They shouldn't necessarily be trained too much to to be selfless and to think only of the common good, because they were supposed to play something of a special role within that society, although quite a heavily circumscribed one. So you can't necessarily train them or teach them to think of themselves only as one among many. They did have to some extent, build up a psychology in which they were something different. In other societies, and especially in Athens, which is the example we know best, the elite would hire private tutors. So they would bring people into their homes to raise their kids. And that's the big difference. That's essentially the only real thing that sets the Spartan upbringing apart from others, is that it was done in a group outside of the household. And so most likely what would happen with the Spartan kings if they didn't go through this is they were privately tutored. Spartans would absolutely follow the wider Greek model of bringing in teachers from abroad. So in that sense, that it's quite easy for us to imagine that Spartan kings would have just been trained by private tutors, just like the elites of other Greek societies. Do we have any idea what he was like as a person? Frankly, no. So we know nothing about him. We know nothing about his attitudes, his opinions, his habits. Later Spartan kings, we might learn a thing or two about how they were in person, and might have some quotes attached to them, things like that. With Leonidas, we just hear things related to the Battle of Thermopylae. And so we are encouraged, although this is obviously very distorting, to think of him as the kind of person who did what happened at Thermopylae. That is essentially all we know about him, and that is all that is known in terms of what he was like. So he is supposed to be is portrayed to us as a person who, in the words of Herodotus, believed that it was wrong for a Spartan to leave his station and wanted the honor of standing his ground and fighting to the death. He thought that that was seemly. He thought that that was appropriate for a Spartan. And that is essentially everything else that we hear about him, all the anecdotes that become attached to him are meant to express that idea. So for instance, him writing a letter to Xerxes saying, come and get my weapons, if you want them so badly. These kinds of things they become attached to him because they fit him, right? That's suitable for him. And there are a couple of other phrases like that which are become attached to Leonidas because it is deemed that that is appropriate for someone who did what he did. We don't know if he really did that. We don't know if he really said those things. It just seems to be right. It seems to be fitting. And so essentially everything about his character is reconstructed on the basis of the fact that he fought to the death. And so we know essentially nothing about what he was like. I think there is a lot of drama that you might get out of a figure like that when you imagine him being a king who is known for nothing else, right? So he hasn't led an army before, to our knowledge. He has never actually done anything worthy of note, which means that he hasn't taken any initiative in terms of policy before. He is sent out with this army to go to Thermopylae. He knows that he is out of his depth there because the Persian army is just too strong, but he's not getting the support he needs to win that fight. And so he is essentially put on the spot and told, okay, now you have to behave like a leader. You have to give the right example. You have to tell us what to do. And he doesn't really know because he has no experience. And he doesn't really have even the upbringing that might have taught him how to behave like a king because he never expected to be a king. And so he's suddenly made to be the guy who needs to make the decisions, the guy who needs to do the right thing, the guy who needs to give the right example, but he has no prior experience of how to do that because he always stood in the shadow of his brother Cleomenes, who was really one of the most famous and successful Spartan kings in history. So we have this guy who ruled for 30 years, led loads of initiative, massively increased the status, the reputation, and the power of Sparta. He is put in the shadow of this great half-brother that he had, and he doesn't really know what to do. He doesn't really know how to cope with that. And so he's put on the spot right at that time and made to say, okay, now what do you do? What do you do? What do you do? This is an unprecedented threat to Sparta, unprecedented threat to the Greek world at large. You have to make the decision. You have to lead. Tell us what to do. Now you have to decide. You have to decide now because the Persians are coming. Okay, they're coming. They're going to kill us all. What do you do? What do you do? What do you do? And under that kind of pressure, I think it's very easy to imagine an old man who had never really had that kind of experience before to default on his upbringing, which was the Spartan upbringing that he went through unexpectedly as a child, which is to say, okay, I follow orders. The order was to stand here. The order was to guard this position, and I'm just going to do that. And if I die doing that, then I will have done the right thing. No one can tell me that I did anything wrong. And I think that is a really interesting way to understand him, to kind of think of him as somebody who cracks under the pressure and defaults on the only thing he knows how to do, which is to follow orders. and that he, in that sense, becomes very unimaginative, but also becomes something that the Spartans really look up to, something the Spartans really admire. And that is essentially, succeeds in spectacular fashion because it just creates such a story that the Spartans can easily tell, saying like, whatever else we may or may not have achieved, we did this one thing which is greater than what any of you have done, which is we threw away our lives in the name of glory alone. And we killed innumerable Persians, and that is all really that is worth telling. That is the only story that is worth telling for a warrior. And that is what Leonidas did better than any of us. So there's different ways of interpreting that final decision. But I think in terms of interpreting his character, it's more interesting to think of him not as a glory hound, not as somebody who just thought single-mindedly of battle, but rather as somebody who was very conflicted about what he was supposed to do, and therefore kind of defaulted on what he knew best how to do, which is this very straightforward saying like, okay, well, we have these values. We know what to do as Spartans. I don't know what to do as king. I don't want to be criticized. I don't want to face the responses of the ephors if I retreat against their wishes. So I'm just going to fight. No one can fault me. And in fact, I'll be dead. So, try and make me face the consequences for this. It is the most noble thing I can do. It's the most Spartan thing I can think to do. That's what I'm going to do. So that's, I think, how we should probably imagine his character, as somebody who is possibly insecure, possibly full of doubt about what he was supposed to do as king, somebody who was very outmatched by the memory of his half-brother, but somebody who was therefore put in a position where he could do something that he thought was ultimately right, and ended up doing this thing that we're still talking about now. The only thing really that he's known for. More about kings in general, but what were the personal holdings of the king as opposed to military aristocracy, as opposed to the Spartan upper class? Do the two kings exclusively get it from tax, or do they do their own private way of wealth generation, or a mix of both? Do they have their individual incomes, or is it a shared pool between the two? Again, the Spartan royal families are just families in Sparta, so they are wealthy, they're prominent, but they're not in any sense set apart. There is no state apparatus that allocates them particular estates or palaces or houses or income or taxation even. The Spartans, in fact, to the best of our knowledge, had no taxation until possibly into the 4th century or even beyond. They had no coinage, they had no means of acquiring or gathering or storing treasuries or wealth. They had no public treasury that we know of. They must have had something, but a lot of that may have been organized through emergency measures. So they don't actually have fixed systems of taxation that you could then redistribute among the kings or institutions of state. So you just have families that share and organize power amongst themselves. And the royal families are two of the most prominent ones, but their wealth comes from their landed estates, which they own. It's entirely theirs. There's a later tradition that Spartan wealth is based on these lots that were awarded by the government, but this seems to be a later tradition based on the 4th century redistribution of land that was organized, or the 3rd century redistribution of land that was organized in a great reform by Kings Agis and Cleomenes that was meant to restore the fortunes of Sparta after its fall. So that is not something that's actually known from earlier periods. So they just had private estates. They just had wealth that came from the production done by helots on their land. And that is the wealth that they had. That is the wealth on which they situated their socioeconomic status. That's all they had. The kings were operating this just like everybody else, just possibly on slightly larger estates, which they have been able to secure through generations of inheritance and intermarriage. And that's basically how it worked. So each of these families were looking after their own estates, just like the other Spartians. And of course, within the Spartan economic system, all their wealth was in goods, and whatever hoarded wealth they might have, which was private and not supposed to be seen in public. And so their wealth was essentially stored agricultural produce, and whatever else they might acquire through luxury trade and gift exchange from abroad. That's basically it. Were Leonidas's remains ever found? And if not, by now, by the Greeks after the battle? Yes, so as I said, Leonidas's remains were supposed to be mutilated by the Persians after Thermopylae. His head was cut off by Xerxes and put on a stake, and his body was thrown in a pit with the other Spartan and other Greek dead. Afterwards, the body was supposedly recovered by the Spartans and brought back to Sparta. So this happened in the middle of the 5th century. Obviously, by then, we can really question, and we really should question, whether it was ever possible for them to find the specific body of Leonidas. But they said they did. And so if we believe that, then the body should be somewhere buried under a tomb in central Sparta. That tomb supposedly was found. It was located and seen by Pausanias in the 2nd century AD, and we know roughly where that might have been. but we don't actually know if it is correctly identified. And as far as I know, no specific remains have been found have been associated with Leonidas himself. But there was a monument in central Sparta where his remains were supposedly buried, and which was, like 600 years later, was still visible to travelers in the Roman period. So that was essentially where he is, or where he's supposed to be. But only heroic deaths, so the deaths of the remains of heroes, the remains of those who received heroic cult, were allowed within city limits, and this is something that happens in a lot of Greek communities. What do we know what he looked like? No, flat out no. We have no idea. We have no surviving depictions. We have no descriptions. We don't know anything about him. Famously, there is a statue that was found on the Spartan Acropolis at the Temple of Athena there, which dates roughly to the 450s or 460s, and which therefore has often been called the statue of Leonidas. But we have absolutely no reason to associate it with him. It could have been any Spartan burial. It could have been some other monument. But of course, we like to think that that's Leonidas, but we don't know. We have no other depictions of him. There's no figurative art otherwise attested in Sparta in this period, and generally, it's just not a thing to really depict figures of this period. Do we know what armor he used? Again, we have no idea. So Spartans at this time, we don't know anything about the equipment. We don't know if they were already using the kind of uniform equipment that later became famous. So we have evidence from the Peloponnesian War onward, so the end of the 5th century BC, that the Spartans were using their uniform tunics, so the red tunics that they would famously wear, and that they were wearing their bronze shields, so the shield that possibly had the lambda blazon on them, although, see other videos on this channel for more on this subject. But basically, we have no evidence of that before the 420s or even the 410s BC. And so at the time of the Persian Wars, we actually don't know if they were already using that kind of equipment. And even if we did, we don't know if the kings used it. So we don't know if they were distinct in some way on the battlefield or if not. So we have absolutely no idea. That is simply not attested. And we should probably assume that he was just dressed like any other hoplite, possibly wearing, a Corinthian helmet, if that was still something that the Spartans did at the time, because you can see that on the statue that I just discussed, the statue that you get from the Acropolis in Sparta. But otherwise, it might have been a simpler helmet. Later on, the Peloponnesian War, they're known to wear these pilos helmets, these very simple conical helmets. We know that he fought among the other heavy armed infantry, so he would have been armed with a spear and sword, most likely. But otherwise, we have absolutely no good sense of anything specific. And I've run out of questions now, so I hope that was satisfactory.
So of course, a very special thank you to Roel for joining us today and finding time to answer these questions. And a special thanks to you guys for asking the questions as well. I hope that you enjoyed them and got the answers that you wanted. If you want to see more of Roel on the channel, then make sure to go and check out our Go Tell the Spartans documentary, where we go on site to the Battle of Thermopylae. The link will be in the description. Thanks very much for watching this video. I hope that you enjoyed it, and I'll hopefully see you in the next one.